Turmoil not seen in 30 years. Simultaneous protests in multiple cities. Words seldom heard before now are shouted by tens of thousands. And the world wonders, will there be bloodshed? How will this end? Are these the first moments that will topple the Chinese Communist Party? The protests in China today are unprecedented. They are large, widespread, and bold in their demands. Zero COVID policies have been brutal. Hundreds of tragedies over 2 years have angered the public. The most recent trigger, a tragic fire in the northwestern city of Urumqi that killed anywhere between 10 and 44 people. State media blamed the victims, but online videos depicted people shrieking in terror from behind doors that were locked by COVID police. Thousands gathered on Urumqi Street in Shanghai to mourn the dead and demand justice. Beijing, Wuhan, Nanjing, many other cities saw similar gatherings. Mostly peaceful, some turned violent. And the messaging, it quickly changed from removing lockdown measures to outright calling for the CCP to step down. The unprecedented protests are larger and more widespread than the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. It is reasonable to think about the beginning of the Chinese Communist Party's end. Here's why. The thousands of Tiananmen Square massacre victims wanted political reform. The idealistic college students hoped the CCP could move towards freedom. It didn't happen. Hardliners that ordered the 1989 killings rose to power and put any road towards freedom in reverse. They did this while convincing the world that wealth building meant democracy building. China entered the WTO. It won favored nation status. It became the world's factory, and it saw some of the biggest wealth gains in human history. The CCP used its record-beating economy to build an environment of material temptation. Corruption and government abuse were built in. Silicon Valley helped build the Great Firewall and a near-perfect surveillance state to keep the people in line. With history books erased, for 3 decades, Chinese remained relatively silent. Sure, every year there were thousands of protests over government abuses, but that surveillance state ensured that they were small and isolated. Chinese instinctively knew not to cross the red lines. Today's demonstrations have crossed red lines. First, unlike the 1989 students who wanted to negotiate reform, today's protests are calling for the CCP and Xi Jinping to step down. Never before have so many Chinese publicly shouted anti-CCP slogans. Secondly, the 1989 students were looking for a brighter future. They mostly flocked to the iconic Tiananmen Square, hoping for negotiations. This time, the protests are everywhere and by everybody. Because young and old, rich and poor, they've all endured the horrors of zero COVID. And they're not looking towards a distant future. They're desperately hoping to make it through the week without being locked down again. Thirdly, smartphones and social media are making it harder for the government to control the narrative. For instance, they couldn't cover up the Urumqi fire quickly enough. Despite the power of the Great Firewall, it's still possible for something to go viral in minutes. One person held up a white piece of paper symbolizing censorship. The next day, tens of thousands did the same. The internet police also failed to prevent people from planning protest locations, and they failed in dozens of cities simultaneously. Chinese abroad also joined in. Harvard, UPenn, Columbia, UC Berkeley, Chinese students at many U.S. campuses held rallies echoing the protesters' slogans. Protesting in China is still a dangerous business. China's SWAT teams can be quite nasty, and their surveillance cameras and phone tracking will find you if they look, and they will destroy you and your family's life. And thanks to the pandemic, there's also that health app. Turn your cell phone red, and you're no longer able to function in society. Your apartment could be welded shut. That millions from all backgrounds are risking these consequences surely scares the CCP. What are they doing about it? Well, so far, we've seen several novel approaches. Remember, I mentioned that in Shanghai, people gathered at Urumqi Road. The road is named for the city where the apartment fire killed between 10 and 44 people. Well, those clever Shanghai police, they removed the street sign, thinking maybe the people would forget it even existed. For several days, searching for protests on Twitter was difficult, and that's because either bots or firewall police reactivated hundreds of dormant accounts and flooded keyword searches like protest, paper revolution, or Urumqi with gibberish or porn. Police are also working hard to manually erase protest footage from people's phones. Here are some random walkers by having to hand over their devices. The police are also resorting to the tried and true methods, beatings in broad daylight of protesters, journalists, or people simply holding white paper or bunches of flowers meant to mourn victims. I should say, however, that despite police brutality, it's very unlikely that tanks and military rifles will squash protesters. China won't want to make world headlines with such images. So how will all of this end? What we're seeing is unprecedented. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, taking to the street, unified in their disgust for the CCP. Long suppressed courage and yearnings for freedom, they're bursting forth. And right on cue, the death of Jiang Zemin occurs on November 30th. He was Chinese leader from 1993 to 2002, but his ugly legacy was felt long after. We'll do a story on just how much he was reviled by the people next time. The point is, momentum is building, and it's all against the CCP. Sure, they have begun to relax zero-COVID policy, but these policies were just the trigger. The people are at a turning point, realizing that the dangers of protesting are less than the dangers of staying silent. Hold on tight and keep your eyes on China. Thanks for watching Eye on China. I'm Liam O'Neill. We'll see you next time.